She came home starving every single day. But why? Sophie's father, Daniel, made sure she had everything: a packed lunch, a safe home, a loving family. Yet, every afternoon she stormed into the kitchen like she hadn't eaten in days. He asked. She dodged. He insisted. She lied. Something was wrong. And when Daniel discovered the truth, it was worse than he could have ever imagined. Because the person stealing her food wasn't a bully, wasn't a classmate. It was someone she was supposed to trust. And Daniel? He wasn't going to let it slide. Every afternoon, Sophie came home starving. She barely made it through the door before rushing to the kitchen, yanking open the fridge, and devouring food like she hadn't eaten in days. At first, Daniel assumed it was just a phase. Kids get hungry, right? Maybe she was hitting a growth spurt. Maybe school activities were making her extra tired and hungry. But then he started noticing patterns. Every morning, he packed her lunch with care. 2 sandwiches, fresh fruit, a juice box, and a small dessert. Enough to keep her full until dinner. Yet, every evening, she acted like she hadn't eaten all day. And that's when Daniel's instincts kicked in. One evening, as Sophie shoveled pasta into her mouth at record speed, Daniel finally asked, "Are you not eating at school?" Her fork hesitated for a second. Just a second. Before she resumed eating. "Yeah, I eat. Too fast. Too dismissive." "You sure?" His voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it. "Because you come home starving." Sophie nodded, avoiding his gaze. "I just get hungry fast, I guess." Daniel narrowed his eyes. His daughter was a terrible liar. That brief hesitation, the way she refused to look at him. Something was wrong. But if she didn't want to talk, pushing her wouldn't help. Not yet. That night, as she slept, Daniel sat in the kitchen, staring at her lunchbox. His mind spun with possibilities. Was she giving her food away? Losing it? Throwing it out? Or worse, was someone taking it from her? His jaw tightened at the thought. If someone was taking her food, then she was scared. And if she was scared, it meant it wasn't just some misunderstanding. It was something bigger. He had to find out. The next morning, as he packed her lunch, he paid extra attention to every item. 2 turkey sandwiches, an apple, a chocolate chip cookie, and a bottle of orange juice. He placed them carefully, memorizing their exact positions. Then he handed Sophie her backpack and watched closely as she left for school. That evening, Daniel was ready. As soon as Sophie walked through the door, he observed her. Like clockwork, she went straight to the fridge, grabbing leftovers and eating like she hadn't had a bite all day. He let a few moments pass before casually reaching for her backpack. "Forgot to check your lunchbox today." Sophie turned sharply. "Dad, you don't have to." But it was too late. He had already unzipped it. His stomach dropped. It was empty. No crumbs, no apple core, no sign that the food had ever been there. Daniel slowly looked up. "You ate all of this?" Sophie's hands fidgeted as she swallowed hard. "Yeah. Lies." She was a slow eater. There was no way she could have finished 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a cookie without leaving a single trace. His heart pounded. Something was definitely wrong. And if she was too afraid to tell him, that only meant one thing. This wasn't just about food. Daniel's jaw clenched. Someone was doing this to her, and he was going to find out who. Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. His daughter, Sophie, was hiding something. Every day, she came home starving, devouring food like she hadn't eaten in hours. Yet her lunchbox was always untouched. When he asked about it, she would barely meet his gaze, mumbling a weak excuse before changing the subject. She was lying. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Daniel knew something was wrong. That night, after Sophie went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the tiny recording device in his hand. It was no bigger than a thumb drive, discreet, nearly weightless. But what it could capture might weigh a ton. He took a deep breath, then carefully tucked it inside her backpack. If Sophie wouldn't tell him what was happening, this would. The next morning, he packed her lunch with meticulous care. A sandwich, an apple, a granola bar, and a juice box, just like always. But this time, he took an extra moment, memorizing the exact placement of each item. Sophie hugged him goodbye, her expression unreadable, then ran off to catch the bus. All day, Daniel felt like he was walking a tightrope. He couldn't focus at work. Every second felt heavier than the last, his mind replaying the same question over and over. Who was taking her food? That evening, when Sophie came home, the routine repeated itself. No words. Just a direct beeline to the fridge, grabbing whatever she could find, eating like she hadn't had a single bite all day. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. Later that night, when she was fast asleep, he retrieved her backpack with steady but tense hands. His fingers found the recording device, and he pulled it out, plugging it into his laptop. His pulse quickened as he hit play. At first, nothing unusual. The faint hum of the school. Lockers slamming. Footsteps on tile. The casual chatter of students. The scrape of a chair against the floor. Then, lunch. A soft rustling. Sophie unzipping her bag. The quiet crinkle of a paper lunch sack. And then, a voice. Low, cold, controlled. "Give it to me." Daniel froze. There was a pause. Just a second too long. Then the sound of something being pulled away. Her lunchbox. Another silence. Heavy. Tense. Then the voice again. Quieter this time. "You know the rules." Daniel's breath came sharp and fast. His grip on the edge of the desk tightened. Sophie's voice followed. Small. Fearful. Can I at least keep the apple?" A beat of silence. Then a slow, deliberate response. "Eat it quickly. And don't tell anyone." Daniel's stomach turned. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't another student. This wasn't a bully in the cafeteria. It was an adult. A teacher. Mr. Warren. The man who was supposed to protect her. The man who had just made the worst mistake of his life. Daniel barely slept. The recording played in his mind on a relentless loop. "Give it to me. You know the rules. Eat it quickly. And don't tell anyone." By morning his fury had sharpened into something cold, something controlled. He wasn't just angry. He was ready. At exactly 8 a.m., Daniel stormed into the school's front office. The receptionist barely had time to greet him before he cut in. "I need to see the principal. Now." Something in his tone made her hesitate. Without another word, she picked up the phone, whispered something, and then gestured toward the door leading to the main office. "Go ahead." Daniel pushed through. Principal Harris, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s, sat behind her desk, hands folded neatly in front of her. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted, her brows furrowing. "This is unexpected." Daniel didn't waste time. "It's about my daughter, Sophie." He threw the recording device onto the desk. "You need to hear this." Principal Harris studied him for a beat before picking up the device. She plugged in her earbuds and pressed play. The office was silent except for the faint crackle of the recording. Daniel watched her closely. At first, her face remained neutral. But then, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Her hands clenched the edge of her desk. By the time Sophie's small, frightened voice asked if she could keep the apple, Principal Harris inhaled sharply. When the recording ended, she removed the earbuds slowly. "This," she exhaled, "this is unacceptable." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Unacceptable. My daughter has been starved and manipulated by a teacher. That's more than unacceptable." Principal Harris didn't argue. Instead, she picked up the phone. "Send Mr. Warren to my office immediately." Daniel's fists curled. His pulse pounded in his ears. This was it. Minutes later, the door swung open. Mr. Warren stepped in. Calm. Composed. Too composed. The man had the same easy, practiced smile that Daniel had seen at school events. The same controlled posture. The same careful, deliberate way of speaking. "Principal Harris," Warren greeted smoothly. "I wasn't expecting a meeting this morning. What's this about?" Daniel clenched his fists so hard his nails bit into his palms. The principal didn't answer. Instead, she simply pressed play. The recording filled the room. And just like that, the mask cracked. It was small at first. A slight twitch of his fingers. A tiny flicker in his eyes. Then, as Sophie's trembling voice filled the air, Warren's throat bobbed. When it ended, the silence was suffocating. Principal Harris leaned forward, her tone ice cold. "Well?" Mr. Warren licked his lips. This is being taken out of context." Daniel's rage flared. "Out of context?" he seethed. "You stole food from my daughter. You made her afraid. What possible context justifies that?" Warren's eyes darted toward the door, as if weighing his chances of escape. There were none. Principal Harris folded her hands. "Mr. Warren, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately. A full investigation will follow, but given this evidence," she shook her head, "I highly doubt you'll be returning." Daniel stepped forward, voice deadly calm. "You took advantage of a child, and now you're going to face the consequences." For the first time, true panic flashed in Warren's eyes. The truth was out, and there was nowhere left to hide. Mr. Warren shifted in his seat, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. His once calm demeanor was unraveling, but he wasn't done fighting. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, forcing a nervous chuckle. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I would never—" "Save it." Daniel's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We heard the recording. We know exactly what you did." Principal Harris exhaled slowly, steepling her fingers. "Mr. Warren, I strongly suggest you stop talking before you dig yourself into a deeper hole." Warren's jaw clenched, but he fell silent. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the man who had stolen his daughter's trust. "How long have you been doing this?" His voice was low, dangerous. "How many other kids have you been taking food from?" Warren's lips parted, but no words came out. Daniel turned to the principal. "Sophie wasn't the only one. I guarantee it. You need to find out how deep this goes." Principal Harris nodded grimly. "You're right." She pressed a button on her intercom. "Get Mrs. Reynolds from Student Affairs in here, now." A few minutes later, Mrs. Reynolds, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, stepped into the office. "We have a situation," Principal Harris said. "We need to discreetly question the students, see if any others have experienced the same thing." Mrs. Reynolds frowned. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Daniel answered before the principal could. "A teacher taking advantage of kids, stealing their food, using intimidation to keep them quiet." Mrs. Reynolds' face darkened. "That's serious. Which is why we need to act now," Principal Harris said firmly. "Gather a small group of students from Warren's classes, but be careful. We don't want to scare them." As Mrs. Reynolds left, Warren shot up from his chair. "You can't just interrogate students based on some exaggerated accusation." His voice cracked. "Sit down," Principal Harris ordered. He did. Daniel folded his arms. "You're nervous, Warren." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Why is that?" Warren didn't answer. 30 minutes passed. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, Mrs. Reynolds returned, and she wasn't alone. 4 students followed behind her. 2 boys, 2 girls. Daniel's stomach twisted. Sophie wasn't the only one. Principal Harris kept her voice soft. "Kids, I need you to be honest with me. Has Mr. Warren ever taken anything from you?" The children exchanged hesitant glances. Then, one of the boys, probably around Sophie's age, spoke up. "He takes our lunches." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Tells us we can't tell." A girl beside him nodded. "He said it was a rule, that some kids don't deserve extra food." Daniel's fists clenched. Another student, shifting uncomfortably, muttered, "He lets us keep a little sometimes, but only if we don't complain." Principal Harris inhaled sharply, her expression dark. She looked at Warren, her disgust evident. "That's enough," she said. "Thank you, kids. You can go now." Mrs. Reynolds ushered them out. The office door clicked shut, leaving only silence. Principal Harris turned to Warren. "Well?" Warren was shaking now. "They're lying," he spat. "They're kids. You can't just—" "Save it." The principal picked up the phone. "This just went beyond suspension. I'm calling the authorities." Warren's face drained of color. Daniel stood towering over him. "You thought you could get away with it," he murmured. "But your little empire? It just collapsed." For the first time, Warren had nothing to say, because he knew. It was over. Mr. Warren sat motionless, his fingers twitching against the armrests of his chair. The silence in the principal's office was deafening. "I suggest you speak," Principal Harris said, her voice cold, unwavering. Warren's lips parted, but his usual smooth confidence had vanished. Instead, his voice came out dry, cracked. "This is absurd. You're done," Daniel interrupted, his tone sharper than a knife. "We have a recording. We have students coming forward. You're not talking your way out of this." Principal Harris exhaled. "Mr. Warren, considering the severity of these allegations, I have no choice but to report this directly to the authorities. You'll be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." Warren's breathing grew uneven. His hands clenched into fists on his lap. This isn't necessary." "Oh, but it is," Harris replied, already dialing a number. "You brought this on yourself." Warren swallowed hard. He looked like a man watching his own execution unfold. Then, suddenly, his fingers loosened, and he slumped forward with a bitter chuckle. "You want me gone?" His voice held a hollow sort of amusement. "Fine. I quit." Harris stilled. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You don't get to run," Daniel said darkly. "Not after what you did." "Oh, I'm not running," Warren muttered, rubbing his temples. "You want a resignation letter? Consider it done." Principal Harris narrowed her eyes. "Even if you resign, You will still be investigated. That won't change. Warren smirked, but it was empty. Do what you have to do. Harris turned back to the phone. Yes. I need an officer at Ridgeway Elementary immediately. Warren's smirk finally disappeared. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as he skimmed the local newspaper. Ex-teacher under investigation for student intimidation. His lips curled slightly. Good. After Warren's hasty resignation, an official investigation had been launched. More students had come forward. Parents had demanded answers. And the school, it had been forced to take serious action. Strict monitoring policies were now in place. Teachers were no longer allowed one-on-one lunch supervision. Cameras had been installed in certain areas. Faculty training had been updated to identify intimidation tactics. But most importantly, Sophie was safe. She walked into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," Daniel said, setting his mug down. "Morning." She climbed onto a chair, grabbing a piece of toast from his plate. Daniel smiled slightly. A few weeks ago, she wouldn't have done that. She would have waited, hesitated, made sure she had permission before touching any food. Now, she knew she didn't have to ask, because no one controlled her anymore. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah." Then, after a moment, she added, "I don't get nervous at lunch anymore." Daniel's heart clenched. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's good, kiddo." She hesitated, then looked up at him. "You're not mad at me, right? For not telling you sooner?" Daniel exhaled. "No, Soph," he said gently. "Never. You did what you thought you had to do. But you don't have to be scared anymore." She smiled a little, then took another bite of toast. For the first time in a long time, she looked like a normal kid. Daniel stood on the porch, watching the darkened street. The air was cool, the silence comforting. Everything had been set right, but he wasn't celebrating. Because deep down, he knew the world didn't change overnight. There would always be people like Warren, predators lurking in plain sight, hiding behind authority, preying on those too afraid to speak. Daniel wasn't naive. He would always be watching, always listening, because no one would ever take advantage of his daughter again. The cafeteria was alive with chatter. Trays clattered, students laughed, and the air smelled of pizza and peanut butter sandwiches. It was just another school day for everyone, except for Sophie. She sat at the edge of the lunch table, her lunchbox in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the latch. For weeks, she had avoided opening it at school. Even after Warren was gone, even after Dad had promised she was safe. But today, something was different. She took a slow breath, opened the lid. Inside, everything was just as it should be. Her favorite peanut butter and jelly, apple slices, a granola bar, and a juice box. The same lunch Dad had always packed. The same lunch that had been taken from her before. Her stomach tightened. Sophie's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the sandwich. For a second, she hesitated. Then, she took a bite. Nothing happened. No voice demanding she hand it over. No cold threats. No rules to follow. Just food, just lunch, just hers. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The school bus rumbled to a stop. The doors creaked open. Sophie stepped off, gripping the strap of her backpack tightly. Daniel was already on the porch, waiting. "Hey, kiddo," he called, keeping his voice light. "How was school?" Sophie hesitated, then gave a small nod. It was okay. Daniel didn't push. He had learned not to. She kicked at a loose pebble on the sidewalk, then shifted on her feet. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind, she whispered, "I ate my lunch today." Daniel's heart clenched. He hadn't asked. He never wanted to pressure her. But hearing her say it, on her own, felt like a victory. "Yeah?" He kept his tone casual. "How was it?" She shrugged, looking at the ground. "It was good." One word. But that one word meant everything. Daniel smiled, warmth swelling in his chest. "Glad to hear it." Sophie shifted her backpack and took another breath, like she was gathering courage. Then, almost too quiet to hear, she murmured, "Thanks, Dad." Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight. She didn't pull away. "Always," he murmured, "because a father's job never ends."